Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to tonight's library event, which is Dr. Vinod Jose in conversation with Dr. Mohan Rao on the state of Indian democracy and its media. Dr. Jose is the executive editor of The Caravan, which, as I'm sure you know, is an English language long-form narrative journalism magazine covering politics and culture. It was relaunched in January 2010 as India's only narrative journalism magazine and has won many awards, including the Louis M. Lyons Award for Conscience and Integrity in Journalism, given by the Nieman Foundation for Journalism of Harvard University this year. The magazine is usually very critical of the establishment and receives threats on as regular a basis as it is sued for defamation. Dr. Vinod Jose is a journalist, editor, and magazine founder. In 2009, he was hired by Delhi Press to relaunch the company's 70-year-old title, The Caravan, which had been discontinued in 1988. He's currently its executive editor. Earlier, he was the founding editor of the Malayalam language publication, The Free Press. His contributions to Indian journalism are in the area of narrative or literary journalism, similar to the style of the Granta, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, and Mother Jones. He has won several awards for his work, including and most notably the Ramnath Goenka Award for his reporting on politics and government. He had also won a Foreign Press Association Award from Carl Bernstein, awarded annually for young journalists in the United States for their outstanding academic and professional achievement. He will be in conversation with Dr. Mohan Rao, a medical doctor specialized in public health, retired as professor at the Center of Social Medicine and Community Health, School of Social Sciences, Jawaharlal Nehru University. He has written extensively on the history and politics of health and family planning and is currently an independent researcher based in Bangalore. As in all other previous talks, please do type your questions in the chat box, and I will ask some of them to Dr. Jose, to Dr. Jose after the conversation. Please keep your questions short. Over to you, Dr. Rao, to start the conversation.
Yeah,
Dr. Rao, if you can please start.
Good evening to everybody. Let me first thank the Bengal Club for giving me the opportunity to have this conversation. I'd like to begin by welcoming Dr. Vinod Jose. Dr. Jose, welcome. May I suggest we talk for about 30 to 35 minutes and then open the floor for a question and answer session for another 20 minutes or so. I'm not a political theorist, but an ordinary citizen concerned with how we are losing our liberties guaranteed by the Constitution, and more concerned too that most of us remain silent. Before we begin discussing the rather ponderous and depressing title given to our State of Indian Democracy in the Media, I would like you to say something about that uniquely wonderful journal, Caravan, that you work for. When did it begin? What was the model? Could it have been Encounter, later revealed to have been a CIA baby? Caravan is, of course, so unique in India. Dr. Jose?
Yeah, I mean, just to introduce Caravan by giving an answer to your question that you just raised. This is probably the second innings or second life of the Caravan magazine, which some of you would know, would probably recall from the 1970s and 80s. This was a magazine which has been around for around 50 years, actually from late 1930s till about 1988. Then the group, the publishing company, decided to move on with a bunch of other titles, which they have had. They specialize in category magazines and concentrated in Delhi. They have today over 30 magazines in 10 languages. So they shut it down in 1988. So in 2009, I was working with the US Public Radio. I was in New York. I was producing an evening news show for public radio, and I was approached by the third generation publisher owner of the company. He wanted Anand Nath. His grandfather, Vishwanath, had started the publishing house in 1938 or 39. That was the time, if you remember, Mahatma Gandhi had asked a number of well-off people, especially in the north, to start publishing, whoever can afford a printing press, to contribute in the freedom movement and so forth. So Vishwanath ji was somebody who took that call and started a publishing house. And Caravan then was one of the first magazines that the group started. But grandson Anandnath wanted to revive it, and he was a very good reader of international magazines. So the initial idea was to launch a magazine which is going to be slightly different from what was in the market, which was news weeklies. Primarily, you will see India Today, Outlook, Week magazine. They were magazines who would do the top story of the past week, and we decided, all right, let's go a little bit more in depth. Let's give more time to the reporters. Let's not hurry them up with a story, because as a journalist, as a reporter who started working in Indian Express and then was working as a foreign correspondent, I was very self-aware of the limitations as a journalist, what we put out on a daily basis. So this was then a new school that we were trying out, something in journalistic academic sense, what is called the narrative journalism school, where this is somewhere at the middle of being a good reporter, being a good writer, being a good scholar. Of course, compromises in all three spheres, but still somewhere trying to please the three masters. So that's how the Caravan was conceived. And now this is the 13th year for me at the Caravan. So I'm sort of technically being hired to launch it the way that the market was thinking that there is a need for that, there is a space for that.
What would be your circulation, or is that a series? I must tell you, I'm a subscriber, although I do not always get my copy. In fact, I can't remember when I got my last copy. So your distribution systems are weak on perhaps an already weak circulation.
Yeah, I mean, that you're right. And, I think it's a mayhem in India for physical hard copy distribution often, that in publishing bodies, we often crib between publications and courier companies and all that. So it's often a mayhem. But as soon as we get a complaint, that's why we have been very liberal in complaint redressal mechanism. Whenever subscribers say that they haven't received a copy, we immediately promptly send one. If they complain again they haven't, we send the third copy. So that's the physical copy issue. The old school issues persist. But what we have also tried, and which has worked very well for our advantage, is the digital subscription. As you can imagine, a number of new young subscribers, and even older subscribers, prefer these days to just have soft copy subscriptions, or what we call. And we also are able to give a discount on that, because there is no newsprint involved, there is no logistics involved. So there is, if you ask me about subscription these days, there is the hard copy subscription. There is the paywall digital subscribers only accessible content. There is a huge number of that. Then there are the third-party subscription platforms like Kindle to Geo to Maxter to all the sort of third-party platforms, where if you are a subscriber to that, you can read Caravan there. So I think put together all three, I would say we would have on a monthly basis, we would have about 20-25 lakh readers.
And what about your advertising revenues? Do they cover all your other expenses?
No, that's very interesting. It's increasingly come down, especially when we do tougher stories, when we do stories which withstand pressure from political power or corporate power. In the initial 4 years or so, we have been quite good. I mean, our business model has been advertising first. But around 2014, we realized that the advertisers, advertisement is coming down, and we changed to a subscription-first business policy, and that's also timed quite well for us. If you look at internationally, even legacy organizations like New York Times and Washington Post internationally have changed the business model from advertisement first to subscription first around the same time. And for somebody like me who has also worked in public radio, this has always been an area of interest and then also an affiliation of kind of, I'm partisan in that sense. I would like readers, or I would like just general public supporting journalism, as opposed to one big advertiser or a couple of those guys, or government advertising. That's always that yeah, I mean, if there are no strings attached, I'm open to that. But then often in certain contexts, it's very difficult to not have some interest. But thankfully for Caravan, we have only taken resources from people who have not told us what to do and what not to do.
Caravan offers a space for serious journalism, the long essay, investigative reporting, the photo essay, and also covers literature and art. I cannot think of any Indian journal like this, and this is why I described it as wonderfully unique. I have particularly enjoyed the almost annual quarrel Mr. Hartosh Singh Bal picks with a certain white Mughal. How do you maintain this balance? Do you have a set of committed journalists that you rely on, or how do you do it? It's truly an amazing thing that you're able to carry off.
We started with 4 people. I mean, it was an experiment for the publishing house also. So they were cautious about the resources which was going into this magazine. But today we have, in a decade, we have grown 10 times. We are now 45 journalists, besides the non-journalistic staff. So we certainly had picked up our team with a lot of care, and we needed to make sure that this is quite different from the daily grind, that journalists are willing to talk and dig deep, and then will not lose attention. May want to put in long hours, and so just generally, I think these are people that, as I said, we fail to please all the 3 masters. But certainly, you will find the make of a Caravan journalist is somebody who will not go to sleep if there is an academic book which is given to them to read. But often, the school that I would have started as a daily news reporter, often most journalists would not want to read something substantial, or if there is a sociological layer to something, it's something that they would want to skim over. Or if we go to a press conference, we could actually be quite rude and ask people to just give what is supposed to be like the 3 paragraphs which we need to dutifully write and file. So certainly the make has been that we've been pushing our team to think more widely, more coherently across, to make them wear different hats. So that, I think, that has paid. And world over, it's not just the Caravan. This school of narrative journalism, you'll find people who are also interested in the craft of writing, people who are also interested in the content, certainly. And also invariably, because the kind of time that you dedicate to each story, they got to be investigative. You can't bore people without necessarily giving something new. So often the challenge is, even if you're just doing a profile of somebody who everybody knows, the challenge is often, how do you find something which then will be new about that person, will be unheard of until then. And if there is a financial angle to a public personality, if there is a political history past, something that needs to be known. So there is an investigative thing without necessarily making a big fuss about that. So that's even just for profile pieces. We would like to see that. Not often we succeed, but the pressure and the push is certainly there in the newsroom to get something new and different, as opposed to just giving a roundup of whatever is known in a longer piece.
And now that we've understood a bit about Caravan, perhaps we can approach the topic we are here to discuss: the state of Indian democracy and the media. The latest World Press Freedom Index, brought out by Reporters Without Borders, shows that India's position has slipped by 2 points in the last 1 year. We now stand at a dismal 142nd place in a list of 180 countries. The number of FIRs against journalists has risen dramatically, as have physical attacks on journalists, including the Caravan journalists covering the Delhi riots or pogrom of 2020. Can you explain some of the factors underlying this attack on the media, especially considering what Ram Guha has said describing Ashoka University can also be said to describe the mainstream media? they crawled when asked to bend. So when they're already crawling, where is the need for this kind of attack on the media? It is not just the instruments of the state that are used against the media, but state-sanctioned mobs. And yet you're not scared to talk truth to power.
It's a very complex question, and how do I answer this? See, I think we as much as we would like to describe ourselves as a peaceful country, that we believe in non-violence and so forth, we should remind ourselves sometimes that the biggest champion, the poster boy of non-violence, Gandhi himself, was shot dead. People who were impatient with him, or people who had problems with him, had killed him. And in Bangalore, I think Professor Rao's city now, probably, Gauri Lankesh, journalist, was murdered a couple of years ago, and she was a good friend of mine. We had traveled together, reported a couple of stories. We have been very violent too. I mean, there is a very violent stream when it comes to opinion, thought, that we have had. I mean, this is just the post-independence India, from Gandhi to, a number of journalists who getting attacked in the rural area, the urban centers. Gauri Lankesh's murder still got some publicity and attention. But the regional language journalists, or the rural journalists who get attacked on a daily basis, is a story unto itself. Then from there, I mean, that's sort of probably the extreme point. Then the attack on press is also through legislations. I mean, you can see utter misuse of colonial era rules, like sedition, for example. I mean, you probably are listening to someone I'm booked for sedition in 10 different cases. If you're following news, 2 months ago, I was, there was an FIR registered against me and, Rajiv Sardesai and many other journalists, including my, publisher owners of the company. And in the farmers' protest, there were 10 FIRs filed in 5 states, and all of them, in all the 5 states, the police was reporting to the BJP governments or to central government directly. Now, there is a pattern that we see here, that press has been under duress for a very long time. That there's certain coverage where we independently follow a story, pursue a story, whether it's farmers' protests or, as you said, the Delhi riots, for example, the targeted violence in Delhi just around this time, not around this time, 13 months ago, last year, over 50 people were killed. And this is when President Trump was here. And then, 2 world's largest democracy, world's oldest democracy, 2 leaders shaking hands. 10 kilometers from there, people were getting lynched, killed, bombed, burnt houses. And journalists, of course, did not give the due attention that the violence was getting. And this is very, very different from how it was in even 2002. The Gujarat riots got a lot of attention, a lot of press coverage. So if you were asking me about the ranking going down, let's just compare the 2002 riot press coverage in India, where all the mainstream journalists were competing, to bring the best story out. You had Indian Express, India Today, NDTV, CNN, I think it was Star TV then, but you had all the journalists on the ground. It was a televised riot, so to speak, as some media scholars call it. Like the television journalists were all there covering it in a very dispassionate way. But you look into last year's riot, or probably, I'm scared in future, whatever more riots we would witness, what kind of media attention would be there. So journalists who were going back to those areas and neighborhoods, even during the pandemic, like my team, 3 of them were attacked, and including a woman journalist was sexually harassed by a Hindutva mob who did not like the team of journalists to be asking those questions and hanging around in the neighborhood. The 2 male journalists were attacked. Yeah, so that's right. So this is I can speak from a qualitative, subjective experience that this is fast, going down the ranking for multiple reasons, for just doing our job. And I think people in power world over, and this is what history teaches us, right? I mean, I think people, the people in the audience, from a city and from a culture that they know and they respect serious scholarship and thought and how, what has happened in history, not just in India, but all over the world. Whenever somebody in power gets very, very impatient with free information and information which is verifiable, accurate, and if they are suppressing it, then we must know that that's certainly there's something really rotten in the system. And journalists, good journalists are to me like grasshoppers. They get the temperature, they get the climate change long before any other bigger beasts get to know. And so it's also important for people in power to just make sure that the journalists don't do their jobs.
You have in an essay titled Not Too Elegantly, The Boiled Frog on 20th November 2020, told us the story of an influential newspaper editor whom you call TKTKG, receiving a call from our Home Minister asking him not to carry a report on an opposition press conference. This is about as brazen as it can get. Is this a rare incident, or would you think this is the new normal?
I don't know. This particular story came to me from the editor directly, and this was, I think, I thought that I'll open a convocation or one of those talks that I had given to a journalism school in Bangalore, and sort of as a little story anecdote that I talked about that. But it's very strange, and it was also shocking for me that you thought that, I mean, nobody called me, no home minister, no prime minister, no national security advisor has ever called me to say don't do this or do this, or no, nobody in that sense. But we know that the pressures work indirectly, and then the words and messages come through in different ways. But when I heard this story, it was like, oh gosh, this is as blatant as you can imagine. Like, somebody who's very powerful calling up an editor and saying that don't show the opposition's press conference or whatever. So that's very blatant. And this also probably explains why we don't have a lot of stories in the newspaper, that if you're following on social media or if you're just generally watching something, everyone has a sense of news, right? All of us as readers, we think that, oh, this story needs to have more attention. I would like to know more about the story. I would splash this news as the front page lead news. So everyone has a sense. And
a whole lot of issues in this essay: rising inequalities in society, atrocities on marginalized populations, the decay in the judiciary, the bad loans made out to crony capitalists, that what you call the legacy media do not cover because of caste, ownership, gender, and indifference. In short, you are saying there are structural factors explaining a very biased elite media coverage. Can you explain this for us with some examples?
Yeah, I mean, Nehru famously called the so-called mainstream press then jute press, and he probably, there was, I mean, Hindi word is, untruth, I mean, there is probably, I mean, that must have been a pun on both, that the big ownership at that point were all mostly people from jute industry, or people who got into news organizations or news media because they thought that, not necessarily because of for any passion for journalism. So even when we describe, our modern Indian historians describe about the nationalist press, I find a lot of problems with it because, like certain bad legacies are not being documented adequately. For example, in Calcutta or the Bengal famine, we have records of journalists, Indian journalists, working in Indian-owned news organizations, walking past dead bodies day after day and not writing about it. And it took several months for any proper coverage of what the famine was like. And then, with all the problems, like it was, I think, a bunch of white journalists working for the Statesman, and then who broke it. And then, of course, everyone else did. But, are we studying the role of our press even before independence? Like, I mean, this is when a number of news organizations, what we then passed on as like the nationalist ones, they were primarily owned by certain caste groups whose interests were either trading or they were doing business with the British, They were money lenders. They were money lenders who have taken over, who kept on giving money to editors or founder journalists who started newspapers and finally took it over, throwing the journalists out. So now those kind of legacies we haven't critically studied in our academic discourse, certainly not in journalistic discourse. We have venerated many of them. The emergency time, for example, I'm very grateful to the Indian Express standing up to Indira Gandhi. But you also see that, the same Indian Express probably is just a shadow of what it should have been if it were to follow the legacy. So then that makes you think, was Ramnath Goenka's Indian Express standing up to Indira Gandhi because it believed in freedom of speech and expression, or because Indira Gandhi as a leader was tough on him, the businessman? There were multiple raids that you can see because there was monopoly practices in mining and so forth. There were, there was in 1971 Goenka contesting as a Jan Sangh parliamentarian. So, was it like two politicians, rivalry, and then free press becoming some, I'm just entertaining that as a hypothesis. I'm not necessarily saying that's the case, but what's our compass? What's our compass if we are standing up for values? Why are we not seeing the kind of stories that we should be seeing? A number of stories that Caravan has published, investigative stories. I also know this because you know that as for journalists, it's kind of, if there is a lead for a good story or a new file, something actually takes a circle in the market before somebody decides to publish it. So often Caravan, as a new kid in the block, often got these files and sensitive stories very late. And it took always a circle in the market. It went to one newspaper and to another and to another. And in the last 6 years, many of them were not showing the courage to publish it. And then those stories came to us, some of them. And then, when we decided that when we looked into it and realized that they were good meritorious stories, we went ahead and published it. And now that's kind of a very, very difficult situation for us as journalists, because we thrive when we have competition, and we must have competition in a democracy. And look at Trump's coverage between New York Times and Washington Post and CNN and MSNBC. Every other day they were, breaking stories, one aspect or the other. And that's how a vibrant democracy should function. And here, we increasingly are letting go good journalists in legacy organizations, and legacy organizations management itself is in a highly compromised position, because somehow they probably ideologically are more attuned to a majoritarian nationalism, which we are witnessing today, as opposed to a kind of a contractual nationalism, which as a country that we were committed to in the Constitution, the spirit of the founding fathers, everything is very evidently towards a contractual nationalism. And the media today, maybe it's the Jute press character that Nehru very rightly identified, that it's just behaving the way that, it should not be behaving in a democracy.
My next two questions are linked, but you can either take them one at a time or together. There is no doubt a global crisis in the media, falling readership, competition from online sources, falling advertisement revenues, cost cutting, mergers and acquisitions, and so forth. How is the crisis in India similar and different from, say, the USA and the UK? Next question is that there is simultaneously a crisis of liberal democracy too. India, Turkey, Israel, Philippines, Brazil, Hungary, and the US. In what way is the Indian situation different? The Freedom House report, Freedom in the World 2021, characterizes India as partly free, ranking it at position 67 out of 100, down from 71 out of 100 last year. Can you discuss some of the linked and underlying factors here in these two crises we are talking about?
I think the two biggest crises, if you ask me, for media anywhere in the world, one is technology. Normally, when there is, for any running news organization, if there is a disturbing technology which comes in, which could be web, which could be social media, then the business model is slightly affected. Like, you don't know what to do. For example, 10 years ago, 14 years ago, when Twitter and Facebook and Google also were bringing in, a large number of audiences to their websites and then giving away content free, it was a huge disruption for the business model. So that's one which is there. First world, second world, third world, whatever market that you speak about. Technology has certainly put a stress on media. There are ways to deal with it. For example, Caravan, we find that kind of disturbance a good one, because that has helped us in distribution. For example, the old school distribution issues, like the courier issues that you talked about, we promote people to come and take digital subscriptions, so that helps us. The second issue is an issue of trust and credibility. Now, that's also a crisis which we see, which has happened in the West, as well as which keeps happening in India, which is increasingly a bigger issue now. But look at the way some of the Western press has dealt with it. I mean, I'll give you one example of the Iraq coverage, the weapons of mass destruction. And somebody like, almost all news organizations in America said, look, there are weapons of mass destructions in Saddam's Iraq, and they should invade and then take it over. And there were editorials after editorials asking for war. And somebody like Judith Miller, I think, the big national security reporter of New York Times, she was caught later publishing lies after lies. They were planting stories, Pentagon or the American establishment was planting stories, and she published it. And New York Times published it. She brought the stories, New York Times published it. But post that, when people were like, all right, why should we read New York Times? Why should we read these newspapers when they're publishing lies? They had a serious introspection. They fired the reporter. They seriously had a credibility, attention to the credibility issue. I mean, just going backward also, the Great Depression time, if you look at the Hollywood movies in 1930s, you will see journalists and editors and publishers as villains in America. Because in Great Depression, most of the media organizations were hands in glove with the big corporations who were actually playing a dirty role in the depression, which led to massive amount of millions of unemployment and business being broken and everything else, the biggest tragedy financially then. Henry Luce, the owner of Time magazine, what did he do? He thought that, okay, he will be out of business if this is how the credibility is going to go. So he reached out to Hutchins, who was then the vice chancellor of Chicago University, and told him, look, if media doesn't have credibility, we are out of business. And we are also, as a country, we are in trouble. So I'm giving you whatever resources you want financially. Take 3 years, 4 years, get the biggest philosophers in the country, biggest scientists, whoever you want. Brainstorm and let us know as publishers and editors, what kind of media should we have? And what they produce, what is known in American press history as the Hutchins Commission report, in communication studies, we call it a social responsibility model of media. But that got evolved after a crisis and after how an industry decided to have some kind of shakeup. Now, certainly it did not fix every issue, but then it created possibilities for diversity in newsrooms. American Society of News Editors, for example, in 1960s, we can see them they're aiming for like 2000, thinking that, okay, American newsrooms should reflect the population percentage. And then no blacks were there in a newspaper like New York Times then. And you would see by 2000 and 2010, for example, you would see more blacks than what's the American population in the New York Times newsroom. Now, that kind of thing, I mean, I don't see any self-introspection in terms of credibility in India. So the second one is a more dire one, because that shows that shows the character of the leadership in the legacy newsrooms. And the leadership certainly is of publishers and certainly is also of editors. Now, we are not interested in any of those.
Dalit Camera, if I remember, brought out a survey on the Dalit representation in the English language media. I don't remember the figures now, but it was really quite abysmal. Now,
Yeah, I think PSDS did a study also. This has not been very different between all those three studies. I think Oxfam did one last year. CSDS did in 2006. The number, if I remember correctly, is 12%. The 12% of Indian upper caste population, so to speak, gets about 90% of the jobs, and about 88% Shudra downward get about like just about 10 or 12% jobs.
what about women? What proportion are they?
Women numbers are increasing, but certainly not in leadership roles.
Okay.
So, yeah.
You obviously have a system of fact checkers and lawyers on board to check the contents and the veracity of your investigative reports. I've been awed by your boldness and your guts, and keep wondering how come this has not led to a raid by the ED or income tax authorities or cases of defamation filed against you.
No, there are cases of defamation. There are cases of defamation. There are cases of sedition. Sedition cases, as I said, 10 cases against us in last month alone, 2 months ago in February alone. Defamation, the National Security Advisor, Ajit Doval's son, opening a company in Cayman Islands, Tech 7. I mean, we broke that story. And this is when father was preaching that, against companies in Tech 7, Indian companies. And then that story certainly, again, a defamation case. Bigger corporations have sued us in Gujarat and other places. So cases are there. And certainly, I mean, see, as you said, we have fact checkers and we certainly put our stories through legal reads. And we take all the precautions and we publish what we can defend legally. And thank God, we have not been, so far, we have been all right with the legal fights. So I think, we are good so far. And I hope we'll continue to be so.
Good for you. Even during the emergency years, black years, as it were, we did not witness these attacks on people's eating habits, attacks on interfaith marriages, attacks on women for dressing in a particular way, and so on. Now the attacks on artists, the rewriting of history, the attacks on public universities in particular, and I too am a victim in JNU, and the all-enveloping fear and self-censorship. Above all, fear. How do you continue?
It's a tough question. I think, we are not an island running a media house, whatever. I mean, we reflect what's in the ecosystem, what's going on in the country. Yeah, I mean, but I'm very hopeful that a crisis, this is a crisis which was expected in some sense, right? There was often an urge for a majoritarian view of India. And then if you look at exactly 100 years before now, in the 1920s, you had Gandhi and Nehru and, even Ambedkar in between his studies coming, all of them with all the differences between what they believed in, they, I think, agreed on one point, which is the nationalism of India has to be a contractual nationalism between different food habits, people with different food habits, religious faiths, languages, all deciding to work and exist together as a people, and the common reference being the constitution. Now, this is exactly the debate which was happening in Europe also then, just the same time. You see Italy and Germany on one side, developing thinking that majoritarian nationalism is what they needed, and France and England on the other side, believing in contractual nationalism. And both of them, the French and the English thought, is what I think probably certainly influenced, Ambedkar and Gandhi and Nehru, and with all the differences that they may have had from a number of issues, which is great. I mean, the debate and then the differences, but at least on the character of the nationalism, they were on one side. On the other side, the majoritarian nationalism, you could see the political Hinduism text getting formed around the same time, what we call Savarkar's Hindutva, the book. Then they're trying to find their ways to bring that to the mainstream. They're trying to get Congress party to do that, but then the dual membership issues come up, they get thrown out. And then that battle, they were on the losing side for the next 20 years. And the first election, for example, I mean, this is the Hindu right probably just cumulatively got less than 5% of the votes. Now, using the constitution, which has been conceived by the contractual nationalists, they have come to power and they have 37% votes. And so they have certainly brought to the mainstream what was then an unfashionable idea, that a nationalism of such a complex subcontinent, deciding to just work on one or two identities and that's it. For language, there is a certain preference. For culture, there's a certain preference. For eating habits, there's a certain preference. And now that is killing all the diversity. So while giving lip service to the biggest diversity nation in the world, that we are all tolerant people, we have actually been practicing something else by night. And there is a bit of a disingenuity, and that's also to give credit. It didn't grow on its own. It grew because it used subjective conditions. They worked really hard. If you look at the RSS, Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, they have over 65 groups or organizations under each of them, for students, for lawyers, for judges, you name it, they have number of organizations. They worked hard. And you look at the other side, the inheritors of contractual nationalism became very corrupt in the process, and they lost a sense of their past and what the promise of their forefathers were. And it will probably take a complete shake-up for them to realize, or for this narrative to re-emerge again. And I don't think the inheritors of the old party systems may necessarily be the new champions or the new sort of founding fathers when the fights are sharpened in that sense, the ideological fights.
Dr. Jose, I think we've been very good with time. Thank you very much. And I will now go through some of the questions and see which ones you could address. There's a question from Basav Rai Chaudhary. What would Mr. Jose recommend we do about the current situation? How can we shake people into action? The opposition is seemingly floundering. So how do we stem this?
I don't know, to be to give a short answer, but I know this, that the way that things are wired and cross-wired these days in politics, there are groups in each party. There are two different groups, one probably willing to go with very pragmatic politics of the day, one which is very puritanical. I think that you see in each party. Those individuals you see everywhere. So it is very difficult for one party to take one position unless we see a certain kind of leadership getting prominence in each of those parties. Now, that is also going to be tough because the way that they all have grown up is that the fundraising is done in a certain way. The communication is done in a certain way. So I think it's just probably a matter of time for many of them to make themselves irrelevant before something else emerge. Now, that is not a very good answer to give in terms of hope. But why I say why I'm feeling still hopeful is because if there is a lot of rottenness in many parties in terms of the funding, in terms of what kind of businesses and assets that they have created, even ideological compromises and so forth. But unless there is a new kind of politics which emerge, and the new politics will emerge, that's what history has taught us. I mean, in many countries, now it's up to a politics which has come through electoral formations. And if it is to be de-seated and unseated, sorry, if it is to be thrown out of power, then you need, again, a large coalitional force, either through electoral means or through culture-changing politics. And now, unfortunately, why I think one side is winning handsomely across the country, if not electorally on all the places. But at least culturally, the elites, the more educated class is going one side. The more upper caste people are thinking in one way. There is, even if the economy is doing bad, the poison which is there with the communal way of thinking is so deep that I think it's the shakeup has to also happen with smaller communities and societies, withstanding. Now we see this. There are patterns where, let's say, I hope to believe that Bengal. I mean, I have, as a Malayali, I'm a Keralite. So, there are lots of parallels and similarities that often when we grow up, we have with Bengal in that sense. So, I mean, I don't know, but unfortunately, I don't know Bengal society as much as I should be knowing. But I can certainly see that the pushback in a Kerala village is quite strong, and that's because there is still like a very strong civil society, and the civil society is not just activists. The civil society is just anybody who wants to take the service of a public, health system. The civil society is somebody who wants to take service of the local school. So I think that kind of resistance, long-term resistance, has to come from smaller communities, putting pressure on the politicians, because at the end, politicians are only mere good managers. They're not necessarily going to do anything unless they see a groundswell.
My friend Prashant, the public health worker, asks, what are your thoughts on enlarging the access to the kind of analytical and long-form content carried by the caravan, which is vital to sustaining democracy among wider audiences, especially rural and non-English speaking ones? How big is non-metro readership and access currently?
So that's the reason we started Hindi operation. Caravan has a Hindi arm today. 2 years, it's 2 years old, and that's getting a lot of traction. And we hope in the second decade that we have already entered in our existence, we hope that we can grow in other languages. I think, a lot of social media platforms, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, all of them really help in reaching a certain kind of age group, perhaps. But I think we are reaching far more people on their handheld gadgets these days, and maybe that's the way to going forward to increase multiplying the readership.
Dr. Uma Das Gupta asks, Dr. Jose, this is with reference to your phrase contractual nationalism. How would you describe it?
That's what exactly the founding fathers who had a dominant hand believed in, which is, we respected the languages, the language diversity. We respected the food diversity, the religious diversity, the cultural diversity, ethnic diversity. But still we called it a nation. We said, like, as long as all of us can agree on a constitution which will guarantee equal rights to everyone, we can live together as a people. And that's India. That was the idea of India. And that was contractual nationalism. And that, as I explained earlier, in England, as well as in France, they said the same thing around then, while Germany, I think it was Bluntschli, who was a Swiss jurist, who kind of argued that majoritarian nationalism was the way to go forward. And Mussolini and Hitler both found right political narratives to sort of take it forward. And they became, we know, we look backward and see what kind of tragedies can happen through such a kind of thing. And it just is a reflection of personal values as human beings, that we can't tolerate somebody eating some kind of food. We can't tolerate somebody going to and worshiping a different god. We can't worship somebody dressing in a certain way, or going out or coming home late. All this, we are intolerant. I mean, we could have our faith systems, but then the moment we try to impose it on the other, that's when the problem starts. So contractual nationalism is a respect for the different tastes, and then still agreeing to live together as a nation.
Dr. Jose, this is something I thought we had discussed, but there is a question here from Mr. Ashok Mukherjee. I thought we discussed this, so maybe you can need to go over it one more time. How could a neutral media, how a neutral media will survive under a situation when the government and corporates are all set to control the media?
How will neutral media survive if there's a consolidation?
With the government and the corporates.
Yeah, there is a consolidation that's already happened, and that was there even before 2014. I mean, I did my PhD in communication of Indian media, nearly 2 decades ago, and at that point itself, that was consolidated. There was huge consolidation. We could see that, but now Mukesh Ambani is not just world's 4th or 6th richest man, but he's also India's biggest media owner and also biggest advertiser in those media who he doesn't own, he advertises, right? So there is certainly a consolidation, and we see whenever we have a big story, even bigger corporations, reach out in a way that the message is very clear. So there is pressure from both government and corporations, directly or indirectly. But I think what we must also remember is that's part and parcel of in a fight for democracy, because Vernacular Press Act in the late 1800s, the British decided to bring up such a legislation because they found the mushrooming press in small towns, and the free independent publications that someone has started and probably just had like 6 months life or 1 year's life, erratic, but still it just spread ideas, it's information. And if you look backward to, let's say, the history of a newspaper like The Guardian, for example, in the United Kingdom, it started 200 years ago as a newspaper, as a mouthpiece of the Labour Party, of the workers. Now it's one of the biggest and most respected newspapers, and it's great for its investigative journalism to just general stuff, regular stuff, daily stuff. So I think in some sense, even if there is pressure and consolidation issue, there will be people who will be resisting it, and maybe their operation may not necessarily be as big as the corporate ones, the legacy ones. But you will also be surprised to know, maybe at a time like this, it's about 7:56 or 8 o'clock. If you go and see a YouTube live, how many people are watching Arnab Goswami's shouting match or something like that, you'll be surprised to see actually probably just very few people, maybe just what only a couple of hundred people. Sometimes I was very surprised to see that. It's not like as big as what we think they are, but they just pocket a lot of advertising revenue.
There's a very interesting question here. Anchita Das Gupta. Can you tell us a little bit about the repression of the free press in Kashmir, as well as repression of coverage of the Kashmiri freedom movement? What is the caravan doing to push back against this state repression and representation of that movement in the Indian mainstream?
Caravan has covered Kashmir consistently, and as much as we could, certainly as a magazine, because we are not in a daily news grind in that sense. But you would see a lot of cover stories on Kashmir. You would see from time to time stories on the web, multimedia, a lot of multimedia stories, video stories. The human rights abuses and what the people of Kashmir go through is what we cover. And certainly it's not, as a newsroom, we are not necessarily speaking from a position of anything else other than just what needs to be covered and what's a good story from a conflict zone like Kashmir. And then what people can make out of it, they make out of it, they form opinions. Often this caravan coverage is used not just nationally and schools and colleges, but also internationally by human rights organizations and other countries to get a fair idea of what's going on in Kashmir. So We just, as journalists, can do what we know what to do best, which is journalism. So I think that's just that's where we should just limit ourselves also. And that's what we have been for Kashmir also, as well as Kashmir also, we have been just doing that. Yeah.
Dr. Jose, it's been wonderful talking to you. I have certainly learned a great deal, and I hope others in the audience too. Would Mr. Mukherjee like to say something?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Jose and Dr. Rao, for this very informative and analytic of conversations. Excuse me, I'd like to call on my colleague, Dr. Professor Choitali Mutro of the Library Subcommittee to deliver the official vote of thanks.
Good evening, everybody. The chairpersons and the members of the Library Subcommittee of the Bengal Club join me in thanking Dr. Vinod Jose and Dr. Mohan Rao for an extremely engaging conversation this evening on today's topic, which is not only the crying need of the day, but has been contextual as well as otherwise in its depth and knowledge. Thanks to all the participants for their patience and their engaging insights and questions. Thanks to Sri Shorojesh Mukherjee for conducting this program. And thanks should also be due to Guru Dash, who has helped in setting up this meet. Thank you again and goodbye.
Good night to everybody.
Good night.
Good night. Good night. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.